All right, everyone, it is 1 o'clock, so we are ready to get started with another great edition of MASSP's Leader to Leader. And thank you so much for those of you as you are joining, doing introductions in the chat. Always good to have so many people from across the state with us. And as I was just watching people check in, I definitely see great representation statewide. So there's no doubt that this topic is resonating with people, as we're going to be talking about revisiting final exams during a pandemic. As we started planning for today's session, we started kind of talking about, what do we really want to key in on today? And, one of the topics was, what's this going to look like at the college level? So when we got to that point, I kind of thought it'd be great to have some kids with us today. So we do have them as well. And when we get to introductions, I'll introduce you to the students. So it's going to be awesome to be able to have that student perspective with us as we go through today. So you'll notice that everybody is doing introductions in the chat, which we always appreciate. And if you actually have a question to ask, if you scroll at the bottom of your screen, you'll notice that you have a Q&A for this session. So if you actually have a question you'd like to pose, please put it in the Q&A box and we will either address it verbally or someone will respond to you in writing. In the chat, if you just have a comment you want to make or something that you want to direct to a specific panelist, you can go ahead and make an adjustment in the chat so that it goes directly to that person or to the whole group. Please know that following this Leader to Leader, we will record. So anybody that may have missed it, who would like to access it later, they'll be able to do so. And after this session, all of you who are signed up as attendees, you will get a copy of the slide deck as well as a link to the recording. Just to kind of remind people, we do record these. So if you ask a question, we will be recording and it will be public in nature. So just know that that's happening. Of course, all the panelists already know that, but just kind of always want people to be aware of that. Another thing that we want to be aware of as we're talking about this is that in many cases, school districts have board policy around final exams. And they may also have board policy about how final grades are determined. So this is one of those things where if you hear a good idea and you want to take it back to your school district, you definitely want to make sure that you have good stakeholder input in making this decision, but also that you're working with your superintendent and potentially that your superintendent is working with the board if those types of policy changes may need to be made. Our panelists for today, we're going to start out with the students, which is really exciting. We've got Ashley Bowen, who's a junior at Michigan State University, and Ashley attended Rochester Adams. We have Maris Ferguson, who's currently a freshman at Oakland University, and Maris attended Lake Fenton High School, and also Kurt Wygant, who's a junior at University of Michigan, who attended Northville High School. And then we have with us Stephen Sneed, who's the supervisor of curriculum and assessment for Oakland Schools. We've got Steve Seward, who's the associate director at MASSP. And then we have 3 wily seasoned veteran principals with us. We've got Thomas Berriman, the principal at Alpena, Kyle Metter from Lake Orion High School, and Michael Ostrander from Belding High School. And these 3 gentlemen kind of have put out there on Twitter, and I unfortunately for them saw it, that they were rethinking final exams. So I drafted them to be with us today. So as we get started here today, we're going to go ahead and get going with the students. So I thought it would be helpful, Ashley and Kurt and Maris, if you would just introduce yourself and also maybe just share what your intended major is at this point, knowing that that could always change. So if we could start, Maris, Ashley, and then Kurt.
Yeah, hello guys. I'm so honored to be here today to talk to you. My name is Maris Ferguson. I'm going to Oakland University with an anticipated major of operations management and potentially a minor in French language as well.
Hi, I'm Ashley, and I'm a junior at Michigan State, and I just finished final exams last night, so I'm very happy about that. My major is kinesiology with a focus in going to a physical therapy school in the future.
Great.
And I am Kurt. I'm a junior at U of M, and I'm a double major in French and International Studies with a minor in computer science. And I am sadly not done with finals yet.
All right. So I did reach out to all three of these students and already talked to them a little bit about finals and kind of what's going on at their schools. So, as educators in the high school ranks are thinking about final exams, many of them worry, like, if you don't take a final exam when you're in high school, are you going to be prepared for when you go to college? So kind of the first question maybe that I have for you is your school giving final exams this year? And if they're giving a final, is it traditional kind of 100-question format, or what is that looking like this year? And anybody who wants to start can go ahead.
I can go first, I guess. So I'm in 5 classes, and it seems like Michigan has kind of left it up to the professors to decide what they want to do. But only in one of my classes do we have like a traditional final, like multiple choice questions, like on the computer. And all my other classes, it's either been like essays or like 3 long answer questions. So, and that's kind of, I've noticed that's been different from the past for me. Normally, I've had either half or like 60% of my classes were traditional sit down finals, but now with the transition to online, I've been seeing the professors focusing more on like essays and stuff like that.
Great.
I would say that ours is actually a little bit different. So I'm in 5 classes right now, and one of them is a lab, which traditionally does not give any final exams. It would just be like a final lab report or something like that. But all my other 4 classes, we did have the traditional final. It did vary a little bit. Like for one of my classes, it was with a lockdown browser. There's a camera on you the whole time. Like it was very locked down. But then from one of my other classes, it was just open book. You can use your notes. So it kind of varies throughout like your professors. And so I think we kind of did the same thing as U of M, where it's left up to the professor.
So Ashley, tell me a little bit more about that with the camera. What's that experience like? So you're at your own computer and they have and there's a camera enabled?
Yeah, so it's this website called Respondus, and so it's like so I have a MacBook, and it would just be downloaded on your computer, and you have to like sign up for it. And then when you enter, if you hit start quiz, you enter it, and then they make you take a video of your environment in your room. They make sure like you can't have any other tabs open, like no phones, no that type of thing. And then they just like watch you during the camera. And if your face leaves the screen, then it like flags you. And so then it would notify your instructor and tell them that you like left the screen and you went to go get something or you got out your notes. So it's that type of thing.
Well, I've known you for a long time, and I know that you have some test anxiety issues to begin with. So I can only imagine how that worked out for you.
Yeah, honestly, it was also one of my hardest classes. It was exercise physiology, and it was not very fun to study for that type of class when like my other classes were just having like open book and that kind of stuff. But like I understand like where they're coming from. But they could have, like, I think one thing that some other classes are doing is they just have the lockdown browser. It wouldn't be like a camera also, because you can do either one. Like you can do both, or you can just do the lockdown browser where you couldn't open up other tabs, like something like that.
Okay, how about you, Maris? What's going on at Oakland University?
At Oakland, they've also left it up to the professors to kind of choose what's the best route for them. I know that university-wide, they've introduced ProctorU, which is a similar program, I believe. And I never had any experience with ProctorU this year, but from what I've heard from other people, it's kind of the same thing where it's like the camera's on you and it tracks your eye movement even. So like if you take your eyes off of the computer, you get marked. And I know that it has caused a lot of technical difficulties for people. So I'm not really sure how they've dealt with that in terms of like obviously exam integrity, but, also just making sure it's a fair exam environment. But for me personally, I know for some of my classes, they just kind of threw the exams out the window and just said, we're not going to do them this year. But for the most part, I've done final projects, final presentations, final papers, things like that nature. And I think that was really beneficial for me. It really showed my application more so than just memorization or even cheating, because I know that's a popular choice for some people when it's just kind of an exam based on memorization.
So what do you guys think about this idea that if you were in high school and you hadn't taken a final exam, then you wouldn't be prepared for college? What would your response to that thinking be?
I can go first. So I went to Rochester Adams for high school, and they had this attendance thing in place when I was there, because I graduated in 2018. And it was this thing where if you didn't miss more than 3 days of school, you didn't have to take finals. And so I never missed school like normally. I wasn't really ever sick or anything like that. So I always was at school. So at the end of the year, I didn't have to take finals. And I think they put that in place my junior year. So the first 2 years I did take finals, but the second 2 years I didn't. And I was fine at school. Like I'm a good student overall, and I put hard work into studying. And I just think that a lot of students, even when you get to college, they just are more, okay, this is college, I need to focus. So I don't think that not giving an exam would truly change my college experience from high school, but that's just my opinion overall.
Yeah, similar to Ashley at Northville, we did take final exams kind of every single year. But I think for me, the more helpful thing going into college was the feedback and the talking to teachers and things like that. Not so much just a final exam, which was just kind of part of life in school and has kind of continued, but not as much into college.
I would say that overall, I think having experiences with taking final exams or any kind of examination like that is definitely beneficial, but I don't think that it would greatly affect college performance if they take maybe a semester or a year, maybe even 2 years off of taking final exams, I guess, if that would be the verbiage to use. But I really think that having a break during this pandemic of not having final exams would not be detrimental. But I do think that having experience in high school is very beneficial.
So your dad is making a true confession here in the chat, Maris. He's admitting that he knew that you got an exemption from your exams, but he made you take them anyway. So that's the great thing about having a parent who's a principal or an administrator, right? So any other closing thoughts, kids, before we let you go off to take a nap or do something really important?
One thing that I would say overall is the pandemic hopefully won't last forever. And so I think the kids will have experience taking hard tests, hard finals in the future and or the past. So I think that just this year, or if it happens to be next year, then it wouldn't be as detrimental to their learning as people would say. I know I'm just 20, so you guys have way more experience than me, but that's just my opinion on it. But yeah.
So Ashley, we did have kind of a follow-up question about that software that you referenced. Were there any student or instructor problems with either of the softwares used during the final exam? Just to clarify, were they both free or for students to download?
So we were able to download it from a link that the professor provided for us, and it was free, I think. I didn't have to pay for it. But I didn't have any problems with it. But during my final, which I took on Monday, I never left the screen. Like my face was there the whole time, but I was in kind of a dark room. And so I kind of leaned back because I just was moving around during the exam, and it flagged me, and it said, put your face back in the screen. And so I wasn't doing anything, but it did flag me for that. And so I think that sometimes those little problems exist, but he knows, he sent us multiple emails before saying just make sure that you don't leave the screen or else you'll receive a 0. But if it flags you during the exam, I'll take a look at it and see if it's fine.
Great. All right. Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate your time. I know how busy all of you are. Have a great Christmas, and I hope you get to relax a little bit with your families over break. So thanks so much, guys.
Thank you.
Hey.
Thank you. Good luck.
Thank you.
All right, so we are going to kind of continue on that line. I know that Stephen Sneed from Oakland Schools has done some research for us on what is going on in higher ed with finals. So Stephen, if you would take us from here.
Hey, everybody. Good afternoon. Wendy, thank you so much for having me here. I'm honored to be with you and all 115 of us to really get into this question, final exams, where do we go from here, right? It's refreshing to hear from the students about their experiences at the college level. I've got some information in the slides to give you some nuggets to chew on in terms of how people and groups are responding to this pandemic. And sometimes I have to remind people, we are in a pandemic, so it's okay to think about some things differently than we normally might in a typical school year. So next slide. So the first thing we need to think about, and I bring you peace and greetings from also the Michigan Assessment Consortium and also the Michigan Association of Assessment Literacy Facilitators, and all that's a mouthful. We tend to start questions like this with thinking about purpose. What is the purpose of a final exam? And if you and your staff haven't had that conversation lately, then I would encourage you, to the extent that you can, to think about how you approach that conversation or reapproach decisions that you might have already made in terms of purpose. Why do we give this thing in the first place? And there's lots of very good reasons, or reasons that people might think of, right? We want to prepare kids for a college experience. We want to mimic a college curriculum experience. We want to comply with tradition. Maybe you have board policies that say you have to, or perhaps you want to guarantee some sort of standardization of course objectives across different classrooms. I think many people, when you ask them, at least conversationally, say, well, we want to make sure that students know the content, met the course objectives before they exit the class. But I'm going to push back on that just a teensy little bit. Even in normal circumstances, and especially during our pandemic, students haven't necessarily had equal and equitable opportunities to learning and have access to high quality instruction. So is a single test, a single high stakes test, the best way to measure whether or not students have met course objectives? And that's a question only you can answer in your context with your teachers in your local community, about what the lay of the land in terms of how students have experienced instruction and how valid and reliable a single assessment can be in determining whether or not they've met those objectives. Next slide. So if you haven't heard of the Michigan Assessment Consortium's assessment literacy standards, I would highly encourage you to check those out. The assessment literacy standards from MAC are a collection of sort of like goalposts or gold points of how we should think about assessment in the K-12 practice. The standard document, there's a link there in this slide that I know you'll have access to when this webinar concludes, that gives you the entire collection of standards. There is a standard collection that's just especially worded and formatted for building administrators. There's some for students, teachers, board members, but for building administrators, here's one of these standards. An effective assessment system must balance different purposes for different users and use appropriate assessment methods to measure different learning targets. So when you're having that conversation about purpose, what this standard compels you to do is really think about a couple high-level questions. Why are we giving it? For what purpose? Who's going to use it? And what's the best way we can go about measuring this? If in your context, well, we give final exams because we always do. Why do we always do? Well, back when Wendy was in charge of our building, she made us do them, and we just keep on doing it, right? That's the reason, right, Wendy? Like, yeah, that principle from 5, 10, 20 years ago made us do it, so we just kind of do it now. It's a great opportunity to sort of rethink what is the purpose behind many of these assessments. Next slide, please. So you, depending upon your context, if you think, and if you've already had conversation that, okay, the purpose of our final exams is to make sure that our kids have met these certain high level course objectives, you might be faced with two paths depending upon local policies. And so what I'm going to show you here in the next couple of slides, and these are examples from higher education, to think about two different paths. So one, do you have board policy that says that you must, it's far too late to engage with your boards about re-examining those policies now? Well, if you have to, there's a path of flexibility that you might be thinking about taking. If you do have flexibility, so maybe you don't have clear-cut board language around final examinations, there's some slides I'm going to show you about trying alternatives. So what are some alternative approaches to the traditional multiple choice final exam or final exam that's constructive response? Next slide, please. So here's a great decision tree. This is from the University of Wisconsin at Green Bay. That pretty much lays it out really easy, I think. It starts with the first question: do you have a final exam listed in your syllabus? Right. So if you declare to students to expect at the very beginning of class, you will take a final examination, well, then there's a path of questions that they take you through. But I kind of like this because flat out they say, well, if you didn't list that in your syllabus, if students weren't aware of it at the beginning of the class commencing, they said you probably shouldn't. If you didn't declare that to students, makes a lot of sense, right? And even then, that yes side, we ask you, is it necessary for the integrity of the course? Now, this is where the policy and practice gets a little tricky, because some of your courses definitely, absolutely lead to some sort of licensure or some sort of certification in which some type of final assessment is necessary in order for students to successfully complete that course and get credit. Well, if it's yes, then we go on to, does a final exam need to be in this typical form or format? And there's some ideas there. And if it's no, you can, what it says, you could give students the option of taking the final or not, as some of the students earlier mentioned, which is a really great concept, right? So really cool, high-level example of a decision-making tree you could share with staff or even share with some members of your community if you are if you're able to make some sort of different decisions. Next slide. This is from a little grab from the Inside Higher Ed. It's a blog and a journalistic organization dedicated to chronicling things across higher education. And so what these authors are saying is be flexible, right? In a lot of structures, you're going to have to, you're going to want to, it might be necessary, but that doesn't mean you have to exactly recreate the assessment experience as we might normally would. So a couple ideas: adjust time to account for technology learning curve. Some students talked about, yeah, we got to install this piece of technology and it's watching our eyeballs in the screen, right? It's like Big Brother watching my test. Well, they might need time to install it. It might not work well on their particular machine. Give them some time to adjust for that if you're trying to implement some sort of proctoring service. Think about getting rid of forced completion, right? So in a lot of online testing systems, you have to complete this question in order to move on to the next section. But some of our test taking strategies ask students to kind of jump around in an assessment depending upon what's really sharp on their minds and what they really need to give some thought about. So if you have a technical assessment tool that says you can't go on to number 2 unless you answer number 1, you might think about turning that feature off. Give students several days to complete an exam, right? The ultimate flexibility. Be flexible with deadlines, reduce the number of choices, avoid all or above or none of the above. Those answer choices tend to unfairly distract students from what might be possible answers. Next slide. This example is from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and thinking about, well, you still want to give a final exam, but maybe you want to redesign it no matter the format. So definitely encourage you to click on that link if you're in the lineup. Yeah, we still want to give final exams, but we want to think differently about the design. It has a great series of charts and decision-making trees. Like if you have a multiple choice, think about this. If you have a constructor response, think about that. So a couple ideas that they present on redesigning, again, repeated thing here: reduce the number of questions or prompts, allow for open book or open note exams, ask students to prepare those notes in advance and get approval from their teachers. Say, okay, all right, these notes seem pretty good. You can use these. Create different versions of the exam. I know that some of our test creating companies and products will automatically do that for teachers. And here's a really cool idea. I love this one here. So include an open response item that requires students to justify a multiple choice item, right? So if question number 10 was like A, B, C, or D, question number 11, why did you choose A? So this gets the student to demonstrate some thinking, because I know that's what we really want to measure. We want to measure their thinking. So I like that too, for example. Next slide. Now, if you are in the lane of, okay, we do have a great amount of flexibility in what we can do regarding final exams, I would highly encourage you to try out alternatives, namely authentic tasks. So let's be honest, and again, I'm the assessment guy around Oakland on the assessment consortium statewide. Yes, standardized multiple choice assessments have their place. And I think in every high school's like mission statement or vision statement, we want to prepare students for the real world. Well, in the real world, there aren't a ton of multiple choice tests that students will take within their choice of career or employment. But there are plenty of projects, presentations, really high stakes things that students will be engaged in. And perhaps we can design assessment experience that mimics some of those experiences, which are authentic tasks. So instead of requiring, again, multiple choice or constructive response, maybe we ask students to make something or do something or perform something still aligned to our standards. We don't want to create fluff, right? We don't want to lower our expectations. We still want to keep those high, but we want to measure their ability to actually do and engage in the task, not simply just answer questions. Next slide. So again, another example here, if you have tests where items are easily scored, instead an authentic task might be involving complex tasks for which there is no right or wrong answer, or something that's not easily scored by a computer. You maybe want to try something where you can see thinking, students can justify thinking. And again, this is the link from Indiana University, and a great, again, a sort of decision-making table. If you do this, maybe you try this in terms of its authenticity. Next slide, please. So finally, I'll end here just a few examples from my neck of the woods. And I see a number of my Oakland friends are here in the webinar today. So hey, shout out to all my Oakland peeps. So you see decisions really run the gamut, right? So from one place, high school's not giving final exams, period, end of story. And students can select whether they want a letter grade or credit, no credit on their transcript. Then we have an example, and I think this is really cool, where students have their choice of assignments to demonstrate, mastery on some sort of culminative project. So students understand what their choices are, presumably this week prior to going on winter break. And then when they come back, they've got time to think about it, work on it, maybe wait for it, y'all, collaborate with other students on it. Hey-o. So we can get students together, culminating projects, give them choice, a lot of student agency, love that. And then lastly, we've got some places that are still like, yep, we are giving a final exam. Teachers are encouraged to develop performance assessments, but we're giving them the freedom to do that with admin approval. So again, these are just a couple examples. I know that everybody's in a different place with decision making. Again, I would just encourage everyone, the first question you want to ask, purpose. What's the purpose of a final exam? And once we have that consensus of our staff, given the flexibility of our existing board policies, what path will we want to take? Could we take a path that's more alternative facing? Or if we still need to give those, what are some options we can take in terms of allowing some flexibility? Because again, you're still in a pandemic, students are still being affected physically, psychologically by the effect of school closures, by the direct effect of COVID. So we are living in different times, and sometimes those different times require different thinking on behalf of leaders.
Stephen, I really appreciate your thoughts. And I think that, really what our goal was today was to not necessarily present an answer. Our goal was to provide thought, right? Like, let's just reason through this. And I guess that's kind of one of the biggest things that drew me to this topic was, just making sure that people are really thinking about their decisions. It's not just, oh, it's final exam time, so we're going to do that. I think you've provided some good alternatives and some good rationale. So I appreciate that. And Steve Seward from MASSP is also going to give you some alternative ideas in terms of assessments.
Hello, everyone. Just to summarize a few thoughts from the people who have presented thus far is just purpose, flexibility, opportunities, know your board policy. And the other thing that hit me is leaving it up to teachers. So what's flexible with teachers to decide and what's consistent? Because if I was a student and had 5 different bosses with 5 different expectations around exams, that might stress me out as well. I'm also thinking through the lens, if there is a video camera on me, even if I'm teaching in a classroom, I act and react differently. So if you're thinking about those lines, think about the stress that may be putting on the learners and their current environment. So always thinking about what's best for the learners as we go forth. So just to throw some other things out here that are going to parallel what you've already heard is think about how do we get students to produce video recordings? So instead of the traditional models, they can take their phone, they can record their answers or responses and make that work for them. How do they use audio recordings? So instead of responding in a written format, you might give them something to think about, and instead of writing it out, they speak it out. So what are the different formats that students might use to check for understanding? Ultimately, that's the goal. And then finally, what are the written responses? Just working with teachers as of late, especially in middle school and high school, one of the stressors is they're having to recreate these assessments because they don't want them out in the open. So even thinking about that, if it's a 50-question test, do we need that anymore? Or can we determine what are the questions that the students must answer and then give them opportunities to choose which ones they want to answer and think flexibly around the current exam so they're not out there and we don't have to remake them as well. Also think about this. You could give them the test or samples of the test, use student examples from previous years and have the students justify if the person did it right or wrong. Again, they could do it in written form, they could do it in oral form, they could do it in a video. Or that other example that's down there, it's Larry's work is to the left, the explanation is to the middle, and then is it correct or incorrect? So having students actually think about these answers so they're not going online and Googling it. There's not a video camera in front of them that they're stressing out about, but their parents also can't really help them if you record it because they're not sitting behind them. And if they did, perfect. They still have to memorize a little bit and get their own thoughts and feelings into it. That's a math example. Here's an ELA example. So examine the comma usage. I know in the secondary realm, a lot of us are stressed about grammar. Throw the examples up in front of the students and let them say what's right or wrong, or how would you re-envision it to make it, like the second one says, to a level 4 within the rubric that the students have been using. So creative ways to make assessment authentic and actually purposeful. Here's another one that comes from Fisher and Fry that I just thought was masterful. It's called Know and Show. Knowing that our teachers have learning targets and success criteria in all of their lessons, what if the students throughout the unit or throughout the semester or whatever it might be, said what they know based on the learning targets and success criteria? The teacher might even plot these out for them so they could choose from them. And then how will they show that they've known it? Here's some authentic examples that we borrowed from them. Is the students just jot down based on those learning targets, what they know and what they learn and how they can prove it. Then the teacher can circle which ones of those will work and perhaps teach into them. Also, a teacher just might want to give some examples of them so that the students can play within those to say which ones are going to work best for them. Scaffolding it for each learner to ensure their success. My hunch is if we do something like this, the students will be authentically engaged. We'll get feedback on what's working and what's not working and what they know and what they don't know. And then also it's going to be, the students aren't going to be cheating. They're actually going to be doing it and thinking of it. And they're going to come up with better examples and ideas than we ever could. Another one is simply this, and more of a lower elementary and middle school level, what they know with math, and then how they can share. Again, the learners are taking agency and moving forward. So as we talk about assessment and feedback, here's one more thing to push out at you is this. Oftentimes with final exams, we give a score. Sometimes we give a score and we provide constructive feedback. And the second one is sometimes we give feedback and at least one positive remark on how to move forward. As the college students mentioned, feedback is in the conversation is where it's at. Check this out though. Those students that we just gave a score to, they're gonna have no gains. So that summative assessment is now over. The other one, when we give a constructive feedback without a score, the learners actually improve twice as much. And when we give a constructive feedback and a score, nothing happens. They read the comments sometimes, they look at the score, and then they move on. So just think about the time that we have as educators and how we want to spend it, and then the student time that we want to spend as well. Just a few more examples for you. It's just math examples. Think through your own lens of the teachers that you work with or the teachers who are online, how you grade things. Some students, you might just circle what the error was and they correct it. Sometimes you just might put a dot next to it. So they have to discover where are the errors. You might even, for those ones that are just go-getters, recheck 5 of them. The last one would stress me out as a mathematician because I don't know where my errors are. So I might need the first one that's circled for me and then ease me into the dots and then recheck. Know your learners and adjust based on them. Students need different things, just as our teachers need different things, and our building administrators need different things. Here's another one for writing. This is what my teachers used to do for me. And then I would look at it and I'd go, oh, thanks. You just did all the work for me. I can just go right back. And now with editing software, I can just go back and fix it. You might choose to do something like this. So there's a spelling error. Don't check the whole paper, but just look for a paragraph. So that second one, there's punctuation and 2 spelling errors. We have to discover where they are. And then like the math one, you can put a dot next to things. Again, it's feedback back to the students to grow their thinking. And if we think about assessment critically, they should have a chance to redo it. So that being said, here's a few more things. So as an educator, I know I would stress myself out writing comments or writing feedback. What if we did audio recordings for the students then? And what we might be able to do is 2 or 3 students might have the exact same feedback. So instead of saying their name at the beginning, we just leave it more generic and then give them feedback. A video recording. The other one, if we're not comfortable with that, an audio recording. Do what works for you. But again, it's flexibility within structured choice. The other one is just written feedback. We can do that through error analysis, through affirmations. Some students just need affirmations so that they come back next semester. Or we can say, what are your next steps? We can determine them, or they can determine them. Here's just a few things to throw back at you. Is know your purpose, as it was stated before. Is it to extend learning? Is it to close the gap? Or is it simply to give a grade? Know your purpose and then choose the congruent assessment method. But when we're giving feedback, we can do simply something like this. Name the specific noticing and the result. It can either be through something to improve or it can be done with an affirmation. We all need affirmations right now. Put them out there. The other one that we showed before is highlight the error and describe what to pay attention to, but then let the learner know why it's important to pay attention to that error. So again, these are feedback. This is more important than the grade ultimately, especially if we want them to grow in their thinking. This is a simple one that we can all use. What do you want to stop doing, continue doing, and stop doing as a learner? And I might define some of these for the learner and they might design some, or we can do it collaboratively. Or if we steal from Bruce Wellman's work, here's what you need to think about, here's why you need to think about, and here's your next steps to proficiency. These work for adults, they work for students, they work for learners of any age, and my hunch is they prepare every one of our students for college. As you engage with this with your staff, remember your board policy, remember flexibility and consistency, and then you might even desire to have a conversation around what assessment is and what assessment is not with your staff, so you can determine what the right pathways are for the learners. That being said, thanks for your time, and I'm going to push it back to our principal teams.
Awesome job. Both of you did a really great job of kind of talking about what is the landscape looking like in higher ed, you know, what are our options, what are some different ways about going about this. So I think that's fantastic. So in thinking about this, I was wondering, you know, who out there might have already made a decision, we're not giving finals this year. And we had 3 principals step forward and say, yep, as a staff, we've already made that choice. So my friend from Alpena, Thomas, if you would just kick us off, kind of talk about how that decision process started and, you know, like, did you have a board policy? What had to change to make that work?
So in Alpena, we're pretty lucky that we have flexibility at the building level for our final exam. So that was kind of our first step was, oh, let's make sure the board policy, we're good there. And so our return to school plan has us on a hybrid schedule, which means we have 2 cohorts, a green and a white. So they're in the building 2 days a week. and they're remote 3 days a week. So even if we were face-to-face, a traditional finals week just doesn't fit into that schedule. And we want to maximize face-to-face time, not time sitting in a classroom taking a paper pencil exam. So that was kind of the first thing that went into it. Number two was, just like a lot of principals in this webinar, we were hit pretty hard with quarantining of staff. That was the number one reason we went remote before Governor Whitmer and MDHHS put in the protocol. We didn't have staff. And so if we try to push ahead with final exams, there's no guarantee we're not going to have teachers and students quarantined. So then you got to deal with a headache of retakes and rescheduling and stuff like that. Then the next hurdle was, well, what if we did it remotely? Alpena is a 650 square mile school district, and we don't have enough internet strength for every kid to have an opportunity to fairly have an exam. So we just kind of looked at each other and said, and we've done a student survey and we've had Google Meets with students. And the number one thing we've heard from students is they're already overwhelmed. Our teachers are stressed out, they're overwhelmed. So this was kind of also one more thing that we could do to help alleviate some of that stress and that feeling of overwhelming of both our staff and our students. And so we just kind of said, nope, we're not going to do it. Staff, if you feel like there's an assessment you need to give, you can build it into your already scheduled time to give, but we're not going to set aside a final exam period, nor are we going to ask grades put in the grade book in the final exam column.
So prior to this decision, like last year, when things weren't, before the pandemic started, what would have been the calculation for grades then? Did you have a formula where a final exam had to be included?
Yeah, each department had a formula that factored in their final exam. So that was just something that led into our flexibility we had with board policy. The board didn't have a policy where it had to be 75% in class, 25% final. We really didn't have that. So we already had flexibility from our district level. So this was just why we were able to pull the trigger quickly, because we didn't really have a hurdle of a board policy to overcome.
Great. Okay. One last question, follow up for you, Thomas. So because you don't have exam periods, then teachers are just teaching in their normal schedule. There was no adjustment made for that?
No, we just decided that we're just going to roll with our normal schedule. Like I said, from day one, we've always put a priority of face-to-face time when our kids are in our building. And so that's just kind of what we're doing. We told our staff, no matter what, we're going to, roll right up to the last day of first semester, trying to maximize as much face-to-face time, whether that be in a classroom or in a remote Google Meet.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Hey, welcome.
I reserve the right to call you back, so don't go away.
No,
All right.
won't.
Okay, so Michael, how did this decision come about in Belding?
Sure. So I've been kind of beating the drum of being an anti-traditional examiner for a while, and COVID provided the perfect storm for this. Very similar situation to Thomas, that we're hybrid, and a similar line of thinking that if we only have, you think about in a quarter or in a semester, you only have 17 days with the kids or 35 days where they're actually in person. How do we want to spend that time? And it didn't make sense to us to spend time at the beginning doing a pre-test so that at the end we could do an exam to determine was there student growth. But it seemed like a poor use of instructional time and face-to-face time. Stephen, some of the things that you talked about are the things that I've been thinking and struggling with. How do I want to say this? Do we need to assess all kids the same way? And I don't think so. Do we need to assess kids to prepare for college 48 times? And I use that number if you have 6 classes per semester and you have 8 semesters in high school, do they need 48 exams so that they're ready for college? And I look at our school, not every kid's going to college. Half of them are not. So we're using this bar that is not realistic for every kid, but every kid is going to have to do some sort of collaboration or creation in their job, in their college. So we wanted to move towards something I wanted to move to something that I felt like was more realistic. And so again, this was the perfect storm. For college-bound students, you're going to take 4 or 5 state standardized assessments throughout high school. You're going to take all the PSAT and SATs and the NMSQT. Most of our kids who are going to college are going to take multiple AP classes, so they're going to have end of course assessment there. Aren't we already providing enough for that we don't need a traditional multiple choice test? We need to prove knowledge in a different way, and we need to be okay with that. So for us, again, it aligned, the timing aligned to do it. I think, quite frankly, our teachers were relieved with the idea that that's one less thing we have to do right now, is worry about this exam. As we don't have board policy on exam, it just says that assessments, there can be multiple types of assessments, so it's nice to have that flexibility. I did spend some time looking at correlation between semester grade and exam grade. What we have done in the past is your exam grade has to be 20% of the overall. Well, less than 5% of students had their overall grade even impacted by the exam grade. And the reason is kids who do well on the exam. Kids who are doing poorly are doing poorly on the exam. We didn't learn anything new there, but tradition told us, well, you got to give that exam, and it's got to be worth 20%. So it's been kind of freeing to move away from it. Will we remain this way going forward? God, I hope so. We certainly aren't going to give exams this term or next term. We moved to a quarter model right now during hybrid, so our kids are only taking 3 classes at a time, which has been, it's a different topic, but another blessing to our teachers and students right now. But because of that, because of what the model that we're in for this year, we're not giving exams at all.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. You provided a lot of good food for thought also. And I think that you're thinking, is something that resonates with me. I'm kind of kicking myself because I wish that I had thought of, getting this conversation going like 2 months ago, so that we could have, positively impacted potentially more thought on this. But the bottom line is, I think that personally, it's never too late. I mean, what have we been doing since the pandemic started, right? We adjust, we, make changes. And so I really am hoping that, this still gives people an opportunity to make some adjustments, even if it's, in the 11th hour. So Kyle, tell us about Lake Orion, also kind of revisiting this topic and making some changes to your exam policy.
All right, thanks for having me today. And so Lake Orion, we haven't cut exams completely yet. I'll go over the reasons for that and how we arrived at that decision. But Lake Orion has a modified block schedule. So similar to what Michael described, we've been on a quarter system for some time. Our kids can take anywhere from 4 to 8 classes, depending on their schedule per term. And those classes can last at a minimum of 10 weeks, all the way up to 40 weeks. The average is 20 or 30 week courses. It's a very confusing schedule. It's taken me quite a while to really get used to it, but I do love it. And the reason that's important, our kids at Lake Orion already went through one batch of exams at the end of term 1, which is in beginning of November. So we had some data from that. And one of the data points, the most important data point for us in the short term, was that our failure rates for courses were really high. I'm sure that the 115 people listening to this can probably nod their head and say, yeah, ours were too. So we knew we had to do something, and probably a couple of things. We have a number of academic initiatives and interventions right now, really trying hard the second term. And a lot of these courses are going to end in January, and they'll begin a new schedule at the end of January. And one of those things that we're doing is the the exam policy. So the process where we got here was we discussed this as a team of administrators, but also with our department chair people, who also worked with their department teachers to get some feedback on this. And what we came up with in the end, Lake Orion's been going in this direction for a while, so this was not just out of the blue. The student in the panel that described Adam's policy with the opt-out for students that had good attendance and that sort of thing, we've been doing that sort of thing for a while as well. And so we decided that it was important to look at our goals, like Steve and Steven said. Our goals are to allow students to demonstrate their learning in ways that works for them, and also to modify our practices, obviously, given the COVID pandemic. Things are not as normal, as we heard from the students as well. So our policy basically this term, everything is an untested experiment right now. We're going to see the results for this in a couple of weeks. But essentially, if students are passing their classes going into final exams, they can choose to opt out of their final exam. And we expect the vast majority of students who are passing with a decent grade to opt out. Our reasoning is they've demonstrated their learning pretty solidly at that point, and so they can opt out. If they do choose to opt into their final exam, we do not have a hold harmless policy completely. We don't want them to like spin a wheel like The Price is Right and hope that they do well on this final exam and that their grade will go up. They can be negatively impacted if they choose to opt in, so they've got to study for it. But we are mandating that students will not fail a course based on a final exam. If they were previously passing, no student is going to get an E because they bombed the final. So we do have that sort of safety net there. If a student is failing the class going into final exams, then we're saying that they're required. Obviously, we can't get them to come in and sit for the final if we're back in person at that point, but we're saying that that final is mandatory for them at that point. And the reason for that is also a safety net where if they get over 80% on that final exam or a lower grade, even they could possibly mathematically pass the class, or over 80, they could get credit without a grade in that course. So we're expecting, just running some numbers preliminarily, a minority of our students to take the final exams. We would be shocked if we were over 20% of our students taking final exams at the end of the term. But like I said, it's an untested experiment at this point. We've still got several weeks left, so we'll see sort of how it goes. The last thing I wanted to say is if any teachers or classes have a final like project or portfolio, they were already ditching the final exam and they have like an art class with a cumulative portfolio, they're still allowed to do that, and that is fine. And previously we had language in our policies saying that we got away from the mandated 20%. And now it's maybe no more than 20%, because you think about like a freshman in an English class taking a final for the first time. We thought it was probably more appropriate for those teams of teachers to assign maybe 10% to that final exam.
Very, very thoughtful process, Kyle. I really appreciate you sharing that. So Ryan is going to queue up a poll for everybody that is with us, just to see where you are at this point. And Thomas, Michael, and Kyle, if you would look at the question in the Q&A and see if you might be able to answer that while everyone else is taking the poll.
So, Alpena High School, we're just a semester, so it'll be just 100% of a student's grade will be based on their progress for that course for the semester. So we don't have quarters right now. We're just purely one semester.
As I mentioned, we previously were 20% exam in core classes. It could be less. Now it's 100% of the points for the quarter. We are on a quarter model, so we don't have to worry about the semester right now. I would also add that all of our classes, their grades are made up of at least 80% assessments. So there's not this kind of unnatural inflation of homework assignment, homework assignment, homework assignment. So you have a teacher pleaser whose grade is an A, even though their assessment maybe doesn't bear that out.
Probably the most accurate way to answer that at Lake Orion is that our students, if they're in a multi-term course, which is most of them, they're in a 20-week course, September to January, they're going to actually get a grade at the end of Q1 in November based on the exams and the work that they've done from September through November. And then they'll get another grade at the end of Q2. So I'm not sure that completely applies with a 50-50 split sort of question at Lake Orion.
Thank you, guys. And if you didn't already see it, the poll results are interesting. We're seeing that we have about 45% taking exams as normal, 29% for failing students only, or for that possibility of an improvement of the grade, and then 32% canceled exams completely. So interesting, food for thought today. I guess maybe some of the key takeaways are understanding and knowing what your board policy is, making sure that if you want to make a change, that you've got the flexibility to do so. But it sounds to me like even if there is no flexibility, you have a board policy, there's no time to impact it, I think you can still have a conversation with your teachers about what is that exam looking like. There's, I personally have never seen a board policy that says you must use a 100-question multiple choice test, right? So generally it'll just have more language around the fact that you have to give a test. It has to be cumulative, maybe something of that nature, but it still does leave the teacher and the school some latitude about what that might look like. And important just really to be thinking about this, because one of the things that there's no doubt there's a significant concern about is just, of course, student mental health, what's going on in families, still connectivity issues. And then really, an end result of a lot of this is failure rate. And that is going to be a topic that we are going to tackle in a Leader to Leader when we get back from break. And Ryan, I think you have a slide for me on that. We've got 2 Leader to Leader scheduled for you as Ryan gets that going. One is, you've been asked to do a lot of surveys by EPIC and the Department of Education about what your continuation of learning plan looks like. Are you in person? Are you remote? Are you hybrid? And then a variety of questions that go with that. So we have Catherine Strunk, who's the researcher that's been getting that data and actually making sense of it. So she's going to be with us on January 6th to talk to you about those surveys. Now those surveys are being completed by districts monthly. So she's going to show you a progression of how things have been changing as you've been turning in those results. MASSP also asked you to do a survey. So Bob Kefchin is going to be with Catherine Strunk, kind of comparing and contrasting some of the results we've seen from MASSP survey results versus what's going on statewide or what's being reported. And then once again, January 14th, we are going to talk about failure rates and disengaged students. So a concern I have in talking to numerous principals getting ready already for the January 14th discussion is, what do we do if you are having a 20 to 30% failure rate for first semester? What does that look like for second semester? Are those students retaking their whole schedule again, second semester? Or are you progressing them into second semester thinking that they're going to make it up during summer school? I think all of us that have been around know if you failed 6 classes, you're not going to be able to make them up in summer school, right? If you did it in a traditional format. So we need to rethink what that's going to look like. Another issue that we need to think about is, are you giving failures an F or are you giving an incomplete? Obviously, that, is a difference. Are you considering credit, no credit? And last time when we were finishing out last school year, there was a lot of concerns about NCAA, will they accept credit, versus grade? So there's just a lot of complexity with this topic. So we have that set for January 14th. And once again, it'll be a lot of discussion and throwing some ideas at you, but not necessarily saying, here's the bright, shiny solution, because there certainly isn't one that just is going to fit everybody. So we look forward to getting back with you after the holiday break. And I truly hope that all of you take time to relax and disengage and chillax with your families, because you all need that time. So thanks so much to our panel. We really appreciate you being with us today, providing some great insights and sharing what's going on in your schools. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.